My name is Harriet Blair, and I'm going to be taking you on a guide of how the pioneers lived when they came to McMinn County. And first, it was a hard journey getting here. They had to travel slow, and they had to travel over rough and rocky roads, and sometimes the roads would be muddy when it rained a lot. And if they were fortunate, they would be able to travel maybe 20 miles a day. And of course, they had to stop. They had to hunt and fish, and they gathered nuts and berries. And this went along with their corn and with their dried meat that they brought along with them in their wagons. And what else do you think the pioneers would have needed? Of course, they would have needed their guns. And their guns were used for hunting and for protection from hostile people. And as they traveled, they'd also brought with them their tools. And they used their tools along the way to clear the brush as they traveled. And then once they got to their homesteads where they were going to be living, they would use their tools to clear the land and to build their cabins. Now, some of the families would have a cabin like this. It would be one big room, and sometimes they would have two rooms. And in those cabins, they would have brought with them things that they would need to have for their food. They'd bring their animals, and the animals would provide their milk, and they would provide the clothing that they would need. And they would also bring things that they would need in their cabin. They didn't have much room in their wagons, so they would only bring the necessities. And one of the necessities they would bring would be their rope bed. And this is a rope bed right here. And under the rope bed would be the trundle bed. And under the trundle bed was for the children. And in the daytime, they pushed it underneath so they'd have room in the cabin, then they'd bring it out at night. Now, the reason it's called a rope bed is because the ropes supported the mattresses. And the mattresses would be stuffed with corn husk, straw, and if they were lucky and could get enough feathers, they might have feathers in their beds. And then the ropes would get loose. Have you ever heard the term, good night, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite? Okay, well, the ropes would get loose, and so the children and the adults would end up sagging and sleeping down on the floor. So every few days, they would have to tighten up those ropes to support the mattresses, so they wouldn't be ending up sleeping on the dirt floor. And of course, the women had the things that they needed. They had their pots and their pans that they used for cooking. Your cabin might have a window, or it might be like this cabin and not have a window. But all cabins would have large fireplaces because the fireplaces were very necessary. They gave us heat, and they gave light, not a lot of light, but a little light, and they were used for cooking. And once you got your fire started, you would keep it. You wouldn't let it go out, because if it ever went out, then you would have to send a child with a pail, and they would have to go to a neighbor's house, which might be miles away, and get some hot coals to restart the fire. And back then, they would start the fire with a flint, some steel, and some dried flax. So either their mother or the children would always put wood on the fire to keep the fire going. The families also made their own candles, and they used animal fat to make their candles. And that would be smelly, and it would smoke up the cabin. So later on, they were fortunate to be able to get beeswax, or they would pick bayberries, and they would boil it to get the wax out. And they would use this mold, a mold like this, to make their candles. They pour the wax in the candles, and they stick a wick in, and that way they would have better candles to burn. Now, later on in the 1850s, families were able to purchase kerosene lamps, and they would use what they call coal oil in the lamps, and that would be better lighting for the family. It wasn't until the 1930s and the 1940s in McMinn County that families were able to get electricity. Most rural areas didn't have electricity. And you might say, well, what do they do all day? Well, the men had their jobs and the women had their jobs. The men would mostly be clearing the land, planting crops or harvesting, hunting and fishing to provide food for the family. And the women would be at home, and they would be working hard chopping wood to keep the fires going so they could keep the cabins warm or to cook. They would also be tending to the children, taking care of the animals. They might have a small vegetable garden close to the house, and they would also be making clothes for the family. So everyone had a job, and they were very, very busy. After World War II, a lot of the men got jobs in the railroads and in the textile industry, but they still kept their farms because their farms is what was used to feed the family. That's where they grow their crops, and they would have, here in McMinn County, they grew mostly corn and tobacco. And they would have their animals, such as the cows and the hogs and chickens, that would provide their meat for them. They also had their pottery, and the pottery was made locally. So the pioneers that would be something that would be very valuable and very useful to them. And they used the pottery, and they would pour their milk in the pottery, and since they didn't have refrigerators back then, they would have spring houses. And they would take their milk and put them in the pottery, and they would store them in the spring houses to keep the milk cold. They would have their baskets, and remember, they couldn't go to the store, so their baskets were hand woven. And so these were very valuable and very useful, and they would use their baskets for gathering the eggs, and this is something that the children might do, picking fruits and picking vegetables. Now, if they were growing fruits and vegetables and they had any excess, anything that was left over that they didn't need, then they would go to the general store, and then they would trade those things for things that they couldn't grow on their farm. They would get things like coffee and sugar and salt, bolts of material. The men had their tools, of course the women had their own tools. Almost all the women brought their spinning wheels with them, and they were built so they could be disassembled, and so they could be packed so they didn't take up a lot of room in the wagons. Then when they got to their homes, they could be reassembled for them to use. These spinning wheels would be used to process the wool, the cotton, the flax, in which the women would turn and spin and make them the long fibers which would be sewn to create their clothing. Now just imagine, it took a long time to make a dress. First they had to shear the sheep, they had to clean the wool, they had to card the wool to get the fiber straight, and then they had to spin it into thread. But you're not done yet. You need to find some plants or roots to dye the threads to make those colors. Now they didn't have very pretty colors like we do today. They were very muted colors. And then you would get your loom, and you would weave the thread into cloth, and then you would have to make your clothes. And this was before sewing machines. So they would have to sew by hand. So they made their dresses and their pants and the skirts by hand. And no wonder. People back then maybe only had 1 or 2 changes of clothing because it took so long. Now this was before sewing machines were common, because sewing machines didn't come about until around the Civil War. So it would take a long time for a lady to make a pretty dress for herself. Until the 1900s, the ladies would have to buy or trade for a bolt of cloth. They couldn't order it out of a catalog like we can now. Certainly you would have brought your quilts with you. The quilts were very, very valuable, and sometimes they would get with their neighbors and they would help each other make quilts. They took a long time, and they would use leftover material, they would use clothing for the children have outgrown, and so they would construct their quilts. Now everything that the pioneers had, they mostly made. They were very, very resourceful. Now this concludes about our pioneer cabin, but as you can look around, you can see a lot of things that the pioneers needed that they have in their cabin. Thank you for coming.